I started off with a rough piece of 5/4 walnut. So I went ahead and used hand tools just to get one side flattened out so that it would be ready for marking gauge so I could mark the thickness on it. I had to take a fair amount off the back side to get to the final thickness, so it didn't make a lot of sense to just waste that onto the floor with hand planes. So I marked it out and then bandsawed the excess waste off, and that leaves me a little chunk that I can use for something. And then I just went ahead and took my joiner plane and cleaned up the other side and refined it down to the final thickness. And yes, I used calipers, which is probably, overkill. I probably could have just gone to the line and it would have been just fine. Um, I do like to use a glue stick to put the patterns on. It's a lot less messy than trying to brush on white glue and so forth. I went ahead and took an awl and marked the 5 holes that need to be drilled around the perimeter of the handle. And I think there's 4 different sizes there in total. So you're changing bits quite a bit during this process. But once the holes are drilled, you've just got a little bit of bandsaw work to do to connect the holes and rough out the shape of your handle. From there on, it's just basically sanding. I went ahead and made a reverse pattern for the opposite side so that when I get ready to shape the handle, I'll have something to look at on both sides. And then it's off to the spindle sander for a little bit of refinement there on the shape and to kind of blend the curves where I bandsawed it into the drilled holes. And anything that I can get to with that sander, I did. Then a little bit of work with a round, half round file. Here I am cutting the nib, or at least sharpening the nib and getting a nice clean surface on it, and then rounding over the uh, horns on the back of the handle. I've got my handle or tote partially complete. I haven't started the actual shaping around the edges yet because I'm going to wait until I cut the slot for the blade. I got this pattern off of Blackburn Tools website, and it's really an excellent pattern. I did modify this one slightly. He didn't have one with a 2-bolt pattern like this, so I did make just a subtle change on this front. I think the original pattern was more like this. In fact, it was this one. So I just cut it off shorter and moved one of the bolt holes for a dovetail saw that's going to have a fairly short plate. One of the things I also did was I made a reverse image for the back side. I found that helps quite a bit when I'm shaping the handle to get it kind of consistent on both sides, because I do just round approximately to this line and then leave this center section flat. I kind of like that transition and the way it looks. This one's already shaped. This is a slightly larger handle. I think this is a small and this is a medium. But that's kind of the shape it'll have. I've laid out my center line for my saw cut to cut the kerf for the blade to fit into, and the way I set my marking gauge is I start with my dial calipers, get an overall thickness. In this case it was 8, you can have camera at 850. So I know that halfway is 425. Well, I set my calipers to 425, lock them down, and then I use the caliper to set my gauge. So it's very accurate. First try, I could check it from both sides. I was dead center. So that really makes it easy. This is another piece of 1095, but this is 15 thousandths thick. And what I did was I filed it 15 points per inch rip, and I think I put 10 degrees rake on this one, so it's not terribly aggressive to start out with. It's 3 inches wide and 10 inches long. Now it's 15 thousandths because once I add the set to the teeth, that'll give me the 20 thousandths that I need for the blade that will fit in here. It should fit a fairly easy slip fit, but maybe just a tiny bit of friction. We'll find out how well I set these teeth. One of the things I did on these teeth was I bought a Somax saw set. I set it to the very finest setting it would go, and it still overset the teeth a little bit. And part of that is having a feel for the plier mechanism on it and not pushing it too hard. But I didn't get too excited about that, because what I did then was I went to the anvil on the back of my vise and took a small ball peen hammer and I just pounded it down all the way along here, flipped it over, pounded it down again, and I just kept checking the thickness with my calipers across the teeth where the set is until I got 20 thousandths. I took a diamond stone and just hit it once down each side, and since this didn't have a handle, I could just hold it in my hand like this, and I made a couple of cuts in some scrap wood just to see if it tracked straight, and it did. Okay, I've got my saw set up. I've got a piece of 1/2 inch plywood and then my blade, and then just a scrap piece of cherry that I've clamped on top of that as a stiffener. Of course, the plywood's too thick to hit the center of the blade, so I've shimmed it up with a piece of cardboard and 3 or 4 sheets of paper underneath that and a piece of wax paper on top. Since I have the paper pattern on here, it didn't slide very well on anything else. I thought this might lubricate it a little bit and make it a little easier to pull. I'm not going to be, going back and forth like a madman here. I'm just going to take it nice and slow and just sneak up on it. Okay, I've slipped my blade in there just to show that it is. I have cut my kerf right to this line. Of course, that's not the position the blade will sit in when it's finished. It'll sit more like that. I used a curved saw handle maker's rasp to do the outside shape on the tote. It works really pretty well. Well, now that the back is on the saw plate, I'm going to slip the handle just underneath the back and use the bottom edge of that to take a knife and mark out for my mortise. I'll also try and set it down in the front. Find the slot here. And try and get a mark on the front for the mortise. Since this is a folded back, it's tapered from top to bottom, and I'm going to try and get the mortise to fit that taper as close as I can. I used my existing dovetail saw to cut just inside the lines that I'd marked for the mortise where the back will seat in the handle to make it easier to remove the material with a chisel. I used an 1/8 inch chisel and just pared away at it, and that walnut actually pares pretty easily with a sharp chisel. And then here I'm just using a chisel to cut the bevel on the cheeks of the saw handle. I'm using the saw nuts to kind of lay out where I'm going to drill the handle and the blade. These are actually brass nuts that I have for another saw. I'm going to try and make some steel nuts and bolts for this one to match the steel back. Once I decide where to put them, I will just take a transfer punch and mark the location, and then I'll be able to be ready to drill. I drilled a small pilot hole all the way through the handle, and then I'll take a 3/16 bit and come in from both sides so I don't blow out any of the grain. Well, to punch the holes for the handle into the saw plate, I bought one of these inexpensive hole punches, and I just tested it out on a piece of mild sheet metal steel, and it seemed to do a pretty good job. I guess we'll see how it does on spring steel plate. A little tougher. Okay, a lot tougher. Wow, that was a whole different ball game. It did punch it out though. Only a couple of smashed fingers in the process, so I'm going to call that a success. In my rush to get the holes marked and punched in the saw plate, I got a step ahead of myself. I've got these holes drilled out for my saw bolts, but I forgot to do the counter bore, and now my Forstner bit doesn't have anywhere to center. So what I did was I turned a little steel pin. It's got a divot in the center of it to help pilot the drill, and I'm going to slip that in here and use it. It's a pretty snug fit to center my drill, and as I push down, this pin will just push down in the hole out of the way while the Forstner bit does its cutting. Well, my little centering pin worked out pretty well. I had one little mistake. It had a real tight friction fit in the first two holes. The third hole, it just wanted to pretty much fall in, and it started to be okay, but once the drill pushed it a little bit, it fell down inside, and then the drill was no longer centered, and I've got a little scratch right here I'm going to have to work out. So what I did instead was I dropped a spring in underneath it. I had a big bag of springs I'd bought with no general purpose in mind, which gave it plenty of tension against the bit. When the spring got bound up, it would stop it, but it got me far enough that I got my outside hole, got the hole here, and then I could center my bit on that to go without the centering device. So had I just drilled a 1/16 inch hole all the way through, then done my counter bores, then done my 3/16 holes, and these are actually a 64th over the 3/16, I'd have been okay. So if you're working on something like this, keep that in mind. Do your counter bores, then drill your holes. I used a 1/4 inch chisel to square up the holes for the saw bolts. Here's the progress so far. I've got the nuts fastened in. I don't have them tight yet because I don't have a split nut driver made yet. But I like the contrast of the silver saw bolts on the walnut, and I also like that they match the silver on the back. So I think it's going to look pretty sharp. Flip it around here. And there's our split nuts on the back, and again they're not all the way down because I don't have a driver. So far so good. It's starting to take shape. Once I get the handle fitted really well, I'll go ahead and finish sanding it, get it ready, and then it'll be time to put the teeth on and sharpen it. I sprayed the tote with de-waxed super blonde shellac. After each of the first and second coats, I sanded with 320 grit sandpaper, and then on coats 3 and 4, I used 4/0 steel wool, and then after the 5th coat, it was steel wool and paste wax. So it came out a nice low sheen. I like it. Okay, well that wraps up part 2 of the dovetail saw build. There will be a part 3 coming up here shortly. I thought I'd mention that the handle maker's rasp that I used in the video came from Tools for Working Wood, in case someone's interested in that. I also, the hole punch I used for the blade was something I found on eBay for I think about $23, so fairly inexpensive.
I'm not sure it's the best way to do it, but it does work. I think if you tried to drill that, you might have to have a carbide drill bit because the steel is pretty tough. But that's up to you. And I may try that in the future if I continue to build some of these. So part three, we'll go ahead and put the thing together and put some teeth on it and sharpen it and try it out. So until then, thanks for watching.